Okay. Welcome everybody to the third in our series of History and Methods in Political Economy series from Ideas and Ishhet. Ideas is, as most people know here, it's JGU, Jindal Global University's research incubator. And what we do is it serves as some sort of interdisciplinary platform for researchers coming in from all possible schools, all possible disciplines, to share insights, to talk to one another. And, that is really the power of, spare me here, but ideas. Ishhet is the Indian Society for the History of Economic Thought. Just like many of its namesakes in the rest of the world, what it does is it gives a platform for scholars to talk about the history of ideas in economics, the history of the discipline, and also understand how concepts like class, political economy have been talked about. It's wonderful to have you. Sharmin, over to you.
Hello everyone, and thank you for joining in. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, who will be giving a third online talk in our series on history and methods in political economy. Our speaker is Prathama Banerjee, and I'd just like to read out some details about her. Prathama Banerjee is a professor at the Center for the Study of Developing Societies in Delhi. She works at the cusp of political philosophy, conceptual history, and literary theory. She is the author of the book Politics of Time, Primitives and History Writing in a Colonial Society, just published in 2006. A more recent book has been Elementary Aspects of the Political Histories from the Global South, which was published in 2020. And she is also the editor of the forthcoming book, The Textual Lives of Caste in India, which will be coming out this year. So, and today we have Prathama Banerjee talking to us about what does it mean to decolonize economics. And I'm sure many of you you'll have gone through the abstract. So I think there is something very interesting and new being suggested through that. And so, and with that, I'd like to hand it over to Prathama.
Hold on. Yeah. Okay. So thank you very much, Sharmin and Ruchira, for giving me this opportunity and for actually creating this platform, which was highly necessary for a while. So I'm delighted to be part of this conversation and hope that this is only the first of many conversations and collaborations that we will have in the future. So I deeply appreciate this invitation. So I'll just jump right in. I hope I'm fully audible, no trouble there. The sound is right? Yeah, the sound is all okay?
Yes, you're audible. Yes, the sound is fine.
Okay, thank you. So, of all the social sciences and humanities disciplines, economics has been the most universalizing. Initially defined as concerned with bare life and basic needs, political economy was meant to deal with the pre-social and pre-cultural aspects of human life, and so claimed to be unconcerned with questions of difference. The first textbook of political economy in India to be translated into a vernacular language, Marathi, Horace William Clift's 1835 Elements of Political Economy explicitly stated that native Indians, like people everywhere else, were controlled by principles of political economy, whether they knew it or not, thus implying that by default, all lives played out universal economic principles, irrespective of time and place. In his wonderful history of political economy education in 19th century India, Iman Mitra shows that school and college textbooks of political economy were basically translations and adaptations of English tracts. Theoretical principles were drawn entirely from British authors, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, James Mill, John Stuart Mill, and so on, though the fact of difference sometimes did raise its head in the illustrative examples cited in the vernacular. As when Nrisingha Mukherjee's 1875 Arthaniti o Arthavyavahara argued that the structure of the Indian extended family called for a very different imagination of income tax. Or when Gopal Dutt's 1862 text, Dhanavidhan, translated the example of the commodity beer in Richard Watley's Easy Lessons in Money Matters, 1832, with the commodity salt without concern for the implications of such a substitution. Political economy thus came to the colony as a package of universal principles and local examples, making, as Iman rightly points out, the act of conceptual translation analogous to the act of commodity exchange, where exchange was meant to ensure equivalence between incommensurable entities without concern for substantive or semantic difference. Economics in the colony was thus nothing if not a derivative discourse. Now, as 19th century political economy evolved into modern economics by the 1930s and 40s, the question of difference came to be further domesticated. This happened, as we all know, through the worldwide imposition of universal economic metrics, such as the GDP, which, as Timothy Mitchell argues, rendered all nations of the world in the image of circular economies consisting of profit-maximizing firms and utility-maximizing households. Economics thus evolved from being a science of wealth and poverty to being a science of pricing. For the calculation of the GDP was based on a nation's aggregate income and expenditure accounts indexed to prices, whether real or imputed. Ellie Cook's fantastic 2017 book on the pricing of progress gives a detailed history of the mechanisms by which everything from commodities to land to human bodies to ideas came to be imputed with prices in course of the rise of American economic thinking. With this anchoring in prices, economics henceforth became fundamentally a theory of choice. Not just a choice between commodities, but choice in general between any two or more options. Henceforth, the game became the generic metaphor for human interactions, with individuals and groups imagined as perpetually engaged in making strategic choices between pre-existing options, depending on the rules of the game and the strategies of other players. social and psychological differences came to be factored in as anomalous or deviant behavior within complex models of strategic choices to be corrected through behavioral nudges that would eventually lead to a universal conformity, or so it came to be believed, to the rules of the game. This universalization of the concept of choice and strategic decision-making as the essence of all human activities, is what is seen as having enabled the disciplinary imperialism of modern economics, which has now come to apply its tools not only to consumption or investment behavior, but also to other human activities like voting, educational, even marriage decisions. In other words, the universalizing drive of economics is now tending to spill over into non-economic domains as well, leading to a recent cacophony of voices calling vociferously for the decolonization and provincialization of economics as a discipline. So in today's presentation, I want to explore with you what decolonizing economics might mean in concrete methodological terms. Now, I should confess right away that I am neither an economist nor a historian of economic thought like Sharmin here. I speak from perspective of a historian of political thought and practice in the hope that this might contribute to a wider discussion on what today is the most hegemonic discipline of all, namely economics. So I believe that the first step towards the decolonization and democratization of economics is a rewriting of the history of not just economics as a discipline or economic thought as an intellectual tradition, but the history of what can be called modern economic reason. Modern economic reason, as many scholars have argued in the last couple of decades, is constitutively colonial in nature. From the time of Cedric Robinson in the 1950s, historians of Atlantic slavery, settler colonialism, and mercantile imperialism have demonstrated how the hegemony of universal economic reason emerged late 18th century onwards through a colonial reordering of the world in terms of civilizational, racial, and temporal hierarchies, with the colonized being seen as lacking the intellectual ability to imagine a future beyond the immediate needs of the present, and thereby lacking what is called economic reason. Institutional historians have demonstrated how modern economic formations, such as the factory and the joint stock company, were founded on the colonial apparatus of the plantation and the mercantile corporation, like the East India Company, institutions which worked by combining a racial logic with monopoly and sovereign prerogatives. Intellectual historians, in turn, have critiqued the Eurocentrism of the canonical history of economic thought, showing, as Manu Goswami shows so beautifully, how so-called pioneers of modern economics, from Robert Malthus to John Stuart Mill to James Wilson, the founder of the journal The Economist, to John Maynard Keynes, putative founder of the welfare state, were direct participants in imperial governance, both as long-distance policymakers and proximate colonial officials. And above all, historical anthropologists from Carl Polanyi in the 1950s to Eduardo Viveiros de Castro today have historicized the constitutive anthropocentrism of modern economic reason that approaches the planet, including its dehumanized populations, as always already available for expropriation and mastery, without concern for the social and ecological integrity of other life worlds. Methodologically speaking, however, I suggest we must go beyond simply the act of writing alternative histories. For alternative histories of modern economic reason pushes us to do the theoretical work of deconstructing mainstream social theory and political philosophy by enabling a critique of the account of the rise of modern economic reason given to us most famously by Marx and Foucault. As we know, Marx argued that unlike in pre-capitalist societies, where surplus was extracted through the direct exercise of political and cultural power, in modern capitalist societies, surplus comes to be extracted via something called the purely economic mechanism of market exchange. Foucault argued, though somewhat differently from Marx, that while pre-modern regimes ruled via the exercise of sovereign, symbolic, and spectacular power, modern regimes of rule operated via the immanent workings of political economy. That is, via the circulation, regulation, and management of money, things, and bodies. Now, these theoretical accounts, distinguishing between the non-modern and the modern, hegemonic in the global academy even today, have now come to be criticized for overlooking the fact that capitalism and liberalism and their assorted repertoire of concepts, institutions, and accounting indexes continue to be driven by an overarching colonial and racial logic, both in the North and in the South. So, responding to heterodox economists who believe that political economy is a relatively more progressive discipline than neoclassical economics, scholars of racial capitalism and colonial underdevelopment have accused Marxist and Foucauldian narratives of the economy of sharing in the colonial modern definition of the economic as being autonomous of sovereign politics and culture wars. They have come to show how working class and social democratic politics of mid-20th century Euro-America, even at the heyday of Marxism-Leninism, was besieged by the exclusion of colored and immigrant workers, and but by the rise of a labor aristocracy in the West, which shared in the metropolis's colonial surplus in the form of state welfare. Decolonial scholars thus insist that there never has been anything called a pure economic reason, despite the claims of Marxism and liberalism. For expropriation in the name of race, religion, and indigeneity was and continues to be central to the history of modernity and capitalism. Extreme racial phenomena like German National Socialism, post-Civil War American Reconstruction, South African apartheid, and settler colonialism in Palestine are thus not exceptions to the logic of liberal governmentality and social democracy, but exemplifications of the secret colonial logic of modern economic reason that comes to the surface most evidently in these extreme cases. Scholars have therefore come to suggest that the identity or the culture question be explicitly brought back to the heart of economics as an important move towards decolonization. Now, while I do agree with this mode of deconstruction of Marx and Foucault, it seems to me that merely exposing the colonial and imperial antecedents of modern economic reason is not quite enough as a methodological move. Decolonizing economics also demands, to my mind, a deconstruction of the nation form. As we know, with empires unraveling after the Second World War and the Great Depression of 1929, Keynes famously reconceptualized the British economy, so far an imperial economy, as the British nation, and made labor welfare and economic redistribution incumbent on national citizenship, to the exclusion of those considered foreign, thus disavowing at one stroke Britain's obligations to its erstwhile colonial subjects. After formal independence, the new nation states of Asia and Africa also uncritically accepted economic nationalism and bought into the universalizing project of Euro-American economics, sidelining heterodox thinkers like Gandhi, Kumarappa, and Radha Kamal Mukherjee in India, who had argued for a different economic arrangement for a post-colonial world. In other words, the new nation states of Africa and Asia fully bought into the nation-centrism and state-centrism of Keynesian thought. And our imagination of welfare economics continues to partake in this, to my mind, obsolete Keynesian model. Seeking to catch up with the industrial West, but having no colonies of their own to exploit, these newly independent nations internally reproduced the colonial logic against their own populations and ecologies, and subjected them to a pedagogical and even coercive regime of modernization and development. The international imposition of the GDP by the United Nations post-World War further naturalized this artificial construct called the national economy, such that henceforward the nation and the economy became coterminous. This not only made economic criticism take the default form of economic nationalism, and so made economic thinking vulnerable to racial, cultural, and identitarian renderings, such as when Europeans blame immigrants and foreign nations like China for their own unemployment problem, it also produced an unresolvable misalignment between political and economic institutions, such as between global corporations and nation states, international trade and currency networks, and national taxation and welfare regimes. As we know, this misalignment has resulted today in the popular perception of nation states as failing to offer economic redress to citizens vulnerable to the global operations of finance and capital, leading to hypernationalisms of the Brexit type. Decolonizing economics therefore demands that economic criticism overcome not only its constitutive coloniality, but also its nation-centrism, which I suggest in turn calls for a rethinking of the history and theory of democracy as a crucial next methodological move. There needs to be two sides to this rethinking of democracy. On the one hand, democracy must be scaled up from being a national political form to being a global form in provenance. Only thus can we imagine a global order other than that of competing national economies, war by economic sanctions, networks of outsourced labor, energy, data, and rare earth mineral extraction, and above all, the network of undemocratic enclaves dotted across the world of sweatshops, border camps, tax havens, special economic zones, and server farms. Citizenship and civic liberties should also be reimagined as part of this project of overcoming the limits of national citizenship. After all, if today citizenship is available for purchase by the rich upon the promise of investment in a country of choice, then it should be equally possible to imagine, as the sociologist Gurminder Bhamra argues in her 2022 book, Imperial Inequalities, refugees and migrants as deserving citizenship and welfare in their country of choice as reparation for centuries of colonial exploitation. It should even be possible to imagine, as Thomas Piketty suggests in his 2019 book, Capital and Ideology, a transnational fiscal regime in charge of global wealth redistribution via a cross-border tax federation, thus delinking tax obligations from the facts of domicile and citizenship, which is a way to basically make corporations pay taxes instead of fleeing to other parts of the world. On the other hand, however, overcoming the nation-centrism of modern economic reason also calls for a rewriting of national histories of democracy in light of the story of how economics came to be the primary governmental technology of modern nation states. My own interest lies in this latter project of writing up a political history of economics in India. So do I have about 10 minutes more?
Yes, you can take 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay.
Sure.
All right. Thank you so much. So then let me briefly dwell on the India story just as an illustrative example. My basic argument is that even before the rise of Keynesianism in post-war Britain, most anti-colonial thinkers in India had already espoused economic nationalism as the only solution to India's colonial impoverishment. This was, however, not inevitable. As Vikram Visana shows in his new book, early thinkers like Dadabhai Naoroji of Bombay, who later came to be venerated as a nationalist icon, in fact offered a global imaginary based on the ideal of labor rights, economic republicanism, and social interdependence maintained by freely contracting workers. However, from early 20th century onwards, as anti-colonialism came to be reduced to nationalism, nationalists set about trying to educate and, if necessary, coerce ordinary Indians into becoming economic subjects proper to modernity, exhorting them to give up caste and religious affiliations, boycott foreign products, and buy national manufactures even at higher prices, take faithfully to disciplined labor and suspend strikes, and learn the practices of banking and insurance, all in the name of nation building. Post-independence, this pedagogical stance towards the national population came to be systematized by the nation state itself, when, in the name of decolonization and development, the state exhorted the people to give up agitational politics and focus on economic activities, if need be, at the cost of postponing immediate consumption needs and giving up home and land for heavy industry and large infrastructure. The argument was that the economic imperative was before and beyond politics. What the political theorist Sudipto Kaviraj calls the enchantment of the state in post-colonial India was founded, in my mind, on this imagination of the modern nation state as an avant-garde economic force that, by way of modernizing the economy, promised to eventually modernize India's backward society. Economic reason thus became state ideology. But shared with free market ideology, the idea that economics and politics were distinct domains of human activity. This conceptual division between the economy and polity acquired a juridical grounding in the Indian Constitution of 1950, wherein political rights and economic needs were made distinct objects of address. The Constitution, as you know, instituted a division between fundamental rights and directive principles of state policy, with issues of livelihood, poverty and employment falling in the domain of state policy, and property falling in the domain of right. By this logic, the economy came to be conceptualized as the background of rights, but not the site or substance of rights themselves, except the fundamental right to property, which, as you know, became hugely controversial in the 1970s when large landholders invoked the right to property to prevent any large-scale land redistribution amongst peasants and landless agricultural laborer in India. This face-off between policy and right, economy and democracy, came to a head when the state suspended civil and constitutional rights in 1975, declaring national emergency in the name of productivity and efficiency, poverty alleviation, demographic control, and, no surprise, socialism. Apparently, the needs of the national economy called for an authoritarian state and a suspension of politics. Can one then say that the nation state in India addresses its demos as two peoples? One is the political people, a sovereign subject with civic rights and representation in the state. The sovereign subject does not need education. They are political by default, despite their so-called backwardness. The other is the economic people, a subject not of rights, but of needs, whose backwardness must be urgently remedied, often against their own wishes, and who must be educated and disciplined into being economic subjects by overcoming socio-cultural identities. This formulation might appear to resonate with Partho Chatterjee's well-known division of post-colonial populations into the citizen and the governed. However, while Chatterjee argues that in the global south, the citizen and the governed are two different groups of people, the elite constituting the democratic citizenry with guaranteed rights, and the commoner constituting the governmentalized subject awaiting patiently discretionary benefits, Labharthi of today, it seems to me that the democratic public and the economic public are indeed one and the same people, operationalized and studied as two. In other words, my argument is that the modern nation works simultaneously with two contradictory orientations: democratic with respect to people as political community, and authoritarian with respect to the very same people as economic body. My suggestion is, and this is very provisional, and I'm really open to discussing this, is that this division of the demos into two publics, the sovereign community and the needy population, also translates into a division between political theory and economics. My argument, therefore, is that decolonizing economics demands that we dwell on the conceptual mismatches between the two disciplines, both as public discourse and as specialized knowledge. These conceptual mismatches disable easy mutual translation between our economic and political imaginaries, and often lead to economic issues being misrecognized as identitarian issues in popular politics, as we are seeing today all over the world. I argue that these conceptual mismatches derive from the different philosophical and ontological assumptions animating these two disciplines. In other words, I suggest that decolonizing economics requires a methodological commitment to a form of interdisciplinary thinking that does not wait for disciplinary overlaps, but in fact faces head-on the conceptual mismatches and contradictions between the two disciplines. So let me conclude by taking just one example of what I mean by this conceptual mismatch. Let me take the example of the contradiction between the ways in which economics and political theory imagine the people. The people, or the collective per se, is imagined as an organic whole when it is imagined as polity, tied together by shared history, identity, sociality, solidarity, and so on. In contrast, the people as economy is imagined as an inorganic whole, produced out of the complex interactions of discrete activities and agencies which nonetheless come together through multiplier effects, butterfly effects, backward and forward linkages, feedback loops, aggregates, statistical distributions, averages, and other such anonymous regularities. In other words, the economy is imagined as a macro effect sans any organic bonding. So if the polity is imagined as a body, the economy is imagined as a machine. The polity emulates the ideal of biological integrity, while economics emulates laws of physics, having shifted from the earlier determinism of laws of thermodynamics to the stochastics of particle physics today. Put otherwise, unlike the democratic public, which appears to come together by transcending self-interest in the name of community, the economic public is imagined as a mass of needy and laboring bodies which come together randomly in functional equivalence. The political people are therefore subject to mobilization and representation, economic people to optimization. The political people are citizens and agents. The economic peoples are subjects and beneficiaries. The political people are addressed through ideology, the economic people through pedagogy, and so on and so forth. In other words, to end, I am suggesting that unlike most humanities and social science scholars, instead of simply trying to turn economics into yet another humanities discipline, by socializing economics or by bringing the question of identity back into economics, I'm suggesting that we actually stay with and tediously work through the ways in which disciplinary methods and conceptions have come to become deeply contradictory in the last 200 years of the history of the rise of the discipline, and take the story further from there. I'll stop there. Thank you very much for your patience.
Yeah, thank you, Prathama, for that incredibly interesting talk. And I think, I have to admit that I think your talk went even like way beyond my expectations of the kind of unpacking that I was imagining would happen any which way. So, but anyway, before I just make some comments, I'd like to tell all the participants here that if you have any questions, please type it into the Q&A box, and I'll read out the questions, and then Prathama can take some time and answer those. Right. So first, it's I don't think I can even give immediately very substantive comments, because I also feel I need to really think through the range of issues that you have put before us here, and I mean, what you have essentially done is a major like striking at some of the deep epistemological roots of what we consider largely to be economics, or even something like just politics and political studies as far as these disciplinary distinctions are concerned. And I find some very interesting resonances, because partially what you're suggesting for us today, it's almost like staying with the categories as they exist and unpacking them further. But at the same time, the very important thing that I thought you also pointed out, that while in the case of anti-colonial movements, why is it that economic nationalism seemed to be the most obvious counter? And of course, most very obvious in the case of India as an example. And the resonance that I find with some of your suggestions is also interesting when we see how some of the major economic nationalists coming from, again, who were speaking towards a more modernist tradition, like say M.G. Ranade, when he's in that famous speech of his, which we today have in the form of Indian political economy as a speech that's put down before us, where he is looking back, of course, to the German economic nationalist, especially Friedrich List, and he's saying that rather than the idea of the homo economicus, or the economic man, as being the basis of economy, we should look to the body politic. But of course, you're suggesting that we even move away from nation centrism, but Ranade and his associates were very much within the framework of nations and nationalism in that sense. So I think what you're suggesting is a very interesting and new way of trying to bring the political back into into economics. And it's kind of suggesting something that we do always want to work on, which is political economy as such, but renewing but restudying the concepts and categories. So I found that very interesting. The just another comment that I have on the side, because as you when we talk about decolonization of any of our disciplines and all, one of the obvious ways and is to kind of challenge the Eurocentrism and a rediscovery of one's own history in that discipline. So, for example, in the case of India, we find like a lot of work and all that happens, say, around Arthashastra. As a, it's seen as a sort of decolonial movement of, rediscovering one's own past and one's own sources as well, which I think is a very valid and important task as well. But there's also that other thing that happens that can we often lean into then the uncritical reception of the past as well, which often happens when one is trying to revive history and one's traditions and all. So this is just the other a line of thought that I had in mind. So right, so those are some couple of broad comments that I could think of. And with that, if either you would like to answer that first, and then maybe we can come to we have a few audience questions as well.
Sure, thank you very much. And you're right, I mean, I've read your own writings on economic nationalism, which to me have been very important. There's only one caveat I have against using the term political economy to indicate what we want to do actually today, is that the term political economy has had its own hegemonic history. And it's a certain way of connecting politics and economics, which assume already existing definition of both politics and economics. So the danger of using the term political economy in our kind of work is that we will then immediately be seen in the tradition of Adam Smith, from Adam Smith to Marx, basically, and that standard Eurocentric canon. So because I've worked on the history of political concepts, I have understood this much, that the question is to first ask, what is political about the idea of politics? Similarly, I would like us to think about what is what is the economic before we even say something called political economy? Or is the relationship between politics and economics, as imagined by the political economic tradition, the only plausible way of thinking about that relationship? Or could there be other kinds of articulations of what we want to get at, which is another way of thinking about inequality, equality, and things like that? So that's one response to the political economy question. The second question is, of course, the most important thing to keep in mind, which is that very often the decolonization project, as is happening in India today, turns into a project of nativism, which is to say that we had it all in our own past, and we all had it all right. Now, therefore, it is important to insist on a simultaneous deconstruction of the nation, along with the deconstruction of the global economics, because that is the way in which the decolonization question is pushed under the carpet by liberal thinkers who say that if you talk decolonization, you are necessarily conservative. Right. So I am totally with that, keeping that caveat on the front, up front, in any work of decolonization. Thanks for, responding that way.
Right. So yeah, thanks, Prathama. I think especially your response to my first comment. I think that is the essence of it, in the sense, rethink itself. What is economic is always been I think it's a big thing that especially also intellectual historians have really tried to work with to an extent. Okay, so I'd just like to read out some of the questions
Sure.
from the audience, and maybe you can take them on one by one. But I think they're of some of them are of a very different nature.
Sure.
Yes, so Rohini Sen has written, "What a brilliant presentation. I have a question from the vantage of some teaching of critical international law. So the question is, would the impulse towards economic nationalism for anti-colonialist thinkers in India also come from the fact that the state form is the only juridified political form available to them to transition to at that point in history, and the fact that this form is also closely tied to the separation of the political and economic in many ways?"
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Rohini, and thanks for the kind of warm words. You're absolutely right. I completely agree to you that basically, if I would write a larger paper on these lines, I would like to show how the nation state inheriting the structures and the conceptual apparatus behind the colonial state, and in fact, the East India Company, is crucial in this legacy that we are struggling with today. There is no doubt that however, it seems to me that the question of how the state will look like right after independence was not a closed question in the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. It became closed, to my mind, by the 1950s or so. Because, of course, most famously, Gandhi is making this argument for a complete dismantling of the centralized colonial state and a kind of imagination of an administration which is bottoms up and decentralized. Now, whether we agree with Gandhian's thought or not, the fact is that he is giving a strong critique of the centralized state. He's also giving a strong critique of the British parliamentary system as potentially majoritarian, and which shifts its morals, as he says, by using a terribly gendered metaphor, which shifts its morals depending on the political ideology of the time. So the question is being debated at that time. In Africa, for instance, there is a moment in the 1960s when many of the African nations are becoming independent, of whether single nation states or regional federations are a better way to go post-colonial. And there is a serious possibility of regional federations as political and economic networks as coming into its own rather than just different nation states which follow the colonial territorial borders. Again, in India, federalism of a different kind is being hugely debated, including by Ambedkar, including by the Muslim League, just before independence. In other words, different state structures are actually being debated till the imperative of development and modernization becomes the hegemonic imperative. And that requires a strong centralized state. The reason why India never became as federal as it could have is because the argument was that we need first and foremost economic modernization. And that requires a very, very centralized, if not authoritarian state. So to respond to you, Rohini, in some senses, I am saying the opposite. It was not the state form that caused economic authoritarianism, but perhaps the adoption of economic authoritarianism made this state form to be the only possible option. It seems to me, and this is a complex question, and I think it requires a lot of thinking, but that's my first response.
Yeah, thanks for that. I'll just read out one of the other questions. What are your thoughts on anti-economism? That is, some economists have very famously or infamously, depending on where they lie on the political spectrum, they have embarked on a path to annihilate economics and do away with it as a subject altogether. So what about that?
Well, I mean, I understand sometimes I have sometimes critiqued history as a discipline, even as I am a practicing historian, because from the inside, sometimes the limits of the discipline, or let us say, the frustration with colleagues can take over. Now, I actually believe that despite all its problems, the discipline of economics has some interesting things to think about, or some interesting things to offer. For instance, the economic idea of a macro system, I think, is very important to think politically about also. A macro system in which a macro effect happens without anyone intending it. And we know, by living our ordinary lives, that much of life is about unintended consequences, right? And our inability to, in some senses, systematize a structure out of unintended consequences. Now, economics' basic imperative is to make this argument that all sorts of people do all sorts of things for all sorts of reasons, but it produces one effect. And so there can be a kind of unitary process without ever people coming together as necessarily friends of each other, or, a single society or in solidarity. Now, you would notice, sorry for kind of going on and on about it, you would notice, if you have read this Dipesh Chakrabarty's book called The Climate of History in a Planetary Age, he actually makes a very interesting argument. He says that large systems, which are basically concepts, but are not experienced as such as global climate, can never be understood through the prism of subjective apprehension or subjective experience. So when we actually experience the global climate, we experience it as localized extreme weather events. A forest fire in California, extreme heat wave in India, glacier melting in Siberia, and so on. But even all that put together is not climate change. Climate change is this large interactive system which can only be apprehended as an abstraction. Similarly, it seems to me, in the way that the world actually operates today as a global economy, or a planetary economy, one could say today, it is impossible to apprehend as personal or social experience. It requires certain levels of abstraction anyway. So economics deals with that, and that I think is a valuable insight. The debate is on what kinds of abstractions are better than others. So I am not an anti-economism polemician, as it were, but though I understand economists sometimes doing it, but I think we need to debate on economics by entering the heart of the field rather than from the sidelines, which is often what other disciplines do, such as historians or anthropologists or sociologists. They stay at the sidelines. And of course, economics is not very easy to breach given its mathematical kind of complications. But one needs to make that effort to debate abstractions with economists. So that was a long answer to a short question. Thank you.
We have two more questions, and actually interesting questions. So also, Prathama, if you have more time on your
Sure.
yeah. Okay, so another question that we have is, if decolonization of economics demands the clarification of conceptual mismatches between the political theory and economics, then what could be the first methodological step in practice to demystify such underlying conceptual gaps?
Well, I can only say that I am only trying to do this. Can't say that I can give a definitive answer. But my hunch is that the first methodological step is to basically give up using the economic as an adjective. So economic activity, economic life, economic questions, economic issues, because that assumes we know what the economic is. And begin asking the question about what do we mean when we say that ordinary people find the economic question to be most important. Or this time ordinary people did not vote on economic issues, which is a question all the time, right? In the last many elections, all the election surveys have said that yes, economic issues are flagged by the people, but it's not a voting issue. Now, to my mind, the problem is, that's a question, why? But the bigger question is, what is it that is preventing this translation between economic discontent into a democratic issue? And what do we mean when we say an economic issue is an economic issue, rather than a social issue or a political issue? So basically starting to query what we mean when we say the economic at every step, which is a hard job because it is immanent in the way that we use languages, right? It is part of the way we express ourselves. Methodologically, to my mind, this basically, as I was trying to say, it's basically neither to say economics is pointless, it's a dismal science, it should be pushed back, or to say that economics is the answer to everything. We have to take a kind of middling position and actually breach the borders of economics methodologically, maybe as historians, maybe as anthropologists, maybe as other disciplinary scholars, but in some senses not to take the mismatches more seriously than we tend to do, rather than trying to solve the mismatches quickly. Saying that economics is politics by another name. As large number of scholars say, it is, but it is also not. There is some surplus there that we need to query. So that's, if it can be called a methodology. It's just probably only an approach, not as systematic as a methodology, but I would more or less say something like that.
Yeah, thanks, Prathama. I think we'll take there's one last question that is put up. So this is from Nadira Rajapaksa. She's thanking you for your presentation. And then Nadira writes, I am mostly interested in what you said about identity and culture being seen as divisive in economic history and pedagogy. How can identities be incorporated into development concerns, for example, in a way that is decolonial? In other words, how can identity be used both as a political objective and as a part of economic methodology in the area of development? Does one need to precede or be given priority over the other? Should we start with the political body and its identity and then take their specificities into account in economics?
Yes, indeed. I mean, absolutely, Nadira, thank you. I totally agree that the way in which we have thought of identities, precisely because of the way we have understood Marxism from early 20th century onwards, which is to posit class identity as the opposite of every other identity, whether it be gender or caste or race. That is the reason why, in some ways, economic thinking has been both understood as extra-identitarian as a project, but equally it has always been believed that if we go the economic way, then identitarian divisions will be solved. This is the argument that, for instance, coming from Paris, this is the argument that Piketty basically makes. Piketty basically makes the argument that because social democracy, which is about economic identities, came at the limit of its possibility by 1970s, that what we see today is this plethora of identitarian mobilizations, both by dominant identities, also by dominated identities. But my argument to Piketty would be, but this has always been the case. This is not nothing new that has happened, only because it seems to be happening in post-1970s Europe. In India, working class politics has always been divided on caste lines. Ambedkar famously said that the Bombay textile mill workers do not want to work side by side with untouchable workers. So therefore, there is no place for untouchable workers in industrial India. And therefore, he started his own Labour Party, as you know, and etc. It's always the case that identity has always been heart of economic mobilizations. So it's not a question of it happening now or it happening only theoretically. There is no way in which real life and in real world identity of class can be divided from gender and I feel, and again, this might be slightly controversial, I feel just saying intersectional doesn't also work. Intersectionality is only a descriptive thing. It basically says that everyone is class and gender and sexuality and caste and race and everything. Yes, but so that's a second question. And to my mind, there have been economic projects. For instance, let's take the example of some land reforms that have happened in the 20th century, where the redistribution of land was made incumbent on the registration of the redistributed land in the name not of the head of the household, but the woman of the household. So what we are seeing here is the question of land redistribution in a gendered way. Now, a lot of feminists have argued that land distribution should not just be land distribution amongst the poor, but land distribution amongst poor women. The Sachar Committee report, for instance, which actually argued that the Muslims of India are actually economically at the worst stage in terms of percentage of population than other marginal groups, led to the argument that there should be an indexing of developmental projects regionally. It should be indexed to regional identity, because Muslims in India are very often concentrated. So instead of saying development for Muslims, which, as you know, will create mayhem in India today, that it should be indexed as regional development, which will, in some senses, address the identity issue, but also address the economic issue. So it is absolutely doable. I don't see why not. It's basically overcoming that what seems to be eternal class versus non-class division through which we have learned our politics and learned our economics so far. I hope that makes some sense to the...
Yeah, thanks, Prathama. In fact, I think the last bit of your answer maybe begins to speak a little bit to what I think Ruchira has also put in as a comment and or question in the general chat box as well. I mean, I don't know, Ruchira, if you would just like to come in because I don't think we have time for more questions now, but we
Time.
can.
I was just, and thank you for the excellent discussion. I mean, as an economist, of course, I thoroughly enjoyed it. I got a little nervous when somebody said, do you believe in anti-economism? I'm like, oh no, there goes my job. So, anyhow, I had a quick question on, one way to decolonize economics, could it be feminist economics? Because here we can, start seeing women as, maybe some people see the women as the representative agent. As a Marxist, you would see women as the then average agent, but agent, somebody who can make decisions, make choices, talk about autonomy, but also bring in care work. Care, I mean, one concept could be care autonomy.
Sure, sure. No, you're right. I mean, I cannot say I'm on top of the literature, because there's a very, very long tradition of feminist economists, way before the current decolonial wave has come. Feminist economics and feminist ecology have been very powerful movements. And I totally agree with you on the fact that whether care can become a kind of larger conceptual grid rather than, let us say, either scarcity or growth or development as a kind of larger rubric through which the economy can be reconceptualized. I think it's a very, very productive. I am the only uncertainty I have is whether it can be simply called decolonization, because to my mind, I mean, let's push the envelope a little bit. The idea that care is a domain of women is not empirically wrong, but it is somewhat classist and identitarian, for the simple reason that it has been shown by all sorts of empirical histories and sociologies that amongst the poor and amongst the lower castes and amongst the, single black mothers of the American ghetto, women are seen as incapable of doing care work because they are the primary bread earners. Right. So I'm wondering if equating care with womanhood, and you have put it already that woman is not a monolithic category, is not already a little bit, So it's a tough question. I would think to really think hard. But I do think that the argument that is being made for a long time now, that care work be counted in the gross domestic product index, is an important work to be pushed. And that's the only way in my mind in current times in which what goes around as the lowest paid labor in India, which is domestic work by poor women, can be brought under the rubric of minimum wages in the first place. Only when we kind of price it, which is of course counterproductive, we know. It buys into the economic logic that we are trying to critique. But on the other hand, it's only by pricing it that minimum wages can be then imposed on the domestic economy. So it's a very, very hard question, but it has to have constant conversations. So thank you very much for raising it at the end. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Prathama. I think again that's another. I mean, these questions are because when we make economic demands of of recognition in that sense, also gets into the same kind of a pricing. You
That's
eventually
right. That's
resort to
right.
the
Yeah.
pricing mechanism as well, which is in the. I mean. I hope if we have if Prathama that is has a little bit more time, I'm just wondering. This is just more an open-ended, like loud thinking question, since I mean, while of course I work in the history of economic thought as such, but I am also like a political scientist by training. And in a sense, when you're also talking about the distinction, what has happened is through these kind of conceptual categories that have been created. And you're also saying that you point out towards the end that what has been let me put it this way, that the way in which the Indian state also sees its demos, and kind of therefore one of the implications is also the distinction between political theory and economics. So I'm also now trying to I'm actually wondering also what is now the task of political theory in all of this as well. For those of us who are practitioners of this discipline as well, what is the next task before us? One I can immediately say is, of course, to, as you suggest, rethink democracy also, to start, because that is again, like literally from our undergrad courses, one of the first concepts we study in political theory is democracy. So to begin to reconceptualize that history, of course, is the one obvious method. But how does one, I guess, also start rethinking the state as well? So yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering in terms of also pedagogically speaking, how do we start beginning to make the kind of shifts that that you're suggesting, right? So I don't know. As I said, it's a really loud thinking kind of.
No, I know, I totally agree. So I am basically arguing that instead of economics bashing, we take what economics is saying seriously and critically, but we also turn our attention to our own disciplines
Yes.
and ask the question of why it has been so powerless in front of economics, or what is seen as modern economics today. And you're right in saying that that's because in some senses we actually buy, for instance, that's just one example. Anybody who is not an economist constantly, or anybody who is not an economist today constantly drums on this dichotomy between state and market. Now, any economist who knows the history of economics actually will never make that distinction. The distinction that I think is crucial is a distinction between the economy and the polity, as it has come to be in course of the rise of modern knowledge forms. But the market has always been entirely deeply enmeshed with the state and with what are called economic forms, such as the corporation. So just to say that, oh, we should have a good state to push back against greedy markets is a no-starter, is a non-starter. Because, and this is something that political theory can do. Instead of buying into this popular state market rhetoric, basically show up the deeply entangled story of the rise of the modern state than the rise of the modern corporation. Now, that's again of something that I don't think I am capable of, simply because of the way that we have been trained or way that our disciplinary competence is. But it can be done collaboratively. The other problem with that is corporate archives are more or less closed. Very hard to get access to corporate archives. The other problem is that very often in places like India, contemporary archives are either very dispersed or closed. Very hard to get archives on, let us say, the story of DLF and how Delhi becomes what it becomes. Very hard to get access to the emergency archives. So there are many problems of how to do it, but that should not stop us from trying to or saying that this needs to be done. Similarly, I think that the political theorists can learn a lot from anthropology. I think economic anthropology is another very, very rich field where the possibility of other economic formations or other political formations are available. I am a complete fan of this popular book called The Debt by this anthropologist called David Graeber. Some of you, I mean, it was a major hit after the 2008 recession. And then he went on to write this another funny book. He died, unfortunately, very young. Other funny book called, and very, very prescient book called Bullshit Jobs. I'm a huge fan of his work. He's a bit of a mad scholar, but he does a very interesting job of showing how alternative imaginaries of economic formations, political formations can be brought on board in today's contemporary thinking, not as some archaic story of some quote-unquote ethnic group in Africa or deep prehistoric past of the world, but in terms of contemporary relevance. I think those kinds of things are plausible, hard but plausible. So.
Yeah, thanks, Pratham. Actually, that in itself is really it's very useful. And in fact, I'm so glad you mentioned economic anthropology, because I think a lot of us have found a lot of usefulness, say, starting from the older thinkers, like say Karl Polanyi and all, that all those concepts starting from there. And of course, David Graeber is fantastic for these studies as well. And I think we've there's some more questions and all have come up, but I would think if you want to, you can probably just read. I think to some extent, one or of the questions have been answered through through various comments that you have given. But I mean, I don't want to take up too much more of your time, So for that reason.
No, I think most of the questions are by way of kind of continuing the conversation. And I'm actually cutting and pasting the comments on my documents so that I can think with them more. So thank you very much for all these very probing questions, which I need to think of more hard. I don't think there is a question as such here, but I'm totally with Nadira, your further comments on, on the question of whether things like migration, etc., can be seen as costs in terms of economic metrics, or whether there is a contradiction between, making a political decision even at an economic cost and such like. No, I kind of get where you're coming from. I will think about them more. And the question on intersectionality again, thank you. I think I don't have anything particularly interesting to say anymore. So I will just take these questions with me and kind of come back to you another time, maybe, if that's okay.
Yeah, okay. So I think so with that, at least I think I'll call a formal close to today's session. So firstly, thank you very much, Prathama, for coming and giving us this very, very engaging talk. I think it's given all the economists and the political theorists both quite a bit to and of course historians, sociologists, everyone to even philosophers, I think, to work with all these kinds of questions and all. So thank you very much for that, and for engaging so very well with all our comments and questions from the audience as well. And thank you very much to the audience as well for staying with us for almost an hour and a half now, and for your questions as well. So on behalf of Ideas at JGU and ISET as well, we'd like just to thank everyone, and we hope to hold more such events in the future, and we shall keep you all in the loop for that. So,
And
all
thank
right.
you from my side, and hoping we meet again and
Yes.
continue the conversation.
Yes, definitely. I think this is something this will take lots of time to work on, but equally important. Yes.
Sure. Goodbye and good luck, and see you soon. Bye, bye,
See you
bye.
soon.